So thanks for having me. It's really great to be here and part of all these great speakers today. And I'm sad I can't make it to CogSci, but the rest of the workshop looks amazing too. Um, so the goal of my research program is to understand the developmental, the cultural, and the evolutionary origins of human thought. And to understand our uniquely human capacities, we need to determine what cognitive mechanisms humans and potentially non-human animals are endowed with, how they're shaped by human-specific factors like language and culture, and then how these interact. So today I'm going to be talking about the combinatorial capacities of children, adults, and non-human primates. Specifically, today I'm going to be talking about whether these groups can represent center-embedded non-linguistic structures. And then in the second half of the talk, I'm going to talk through some work investigating how these structures are represented in the human mind. So there are lots of definitions of recursion and center embedding, but here I'm going to be talking about recursive structures or center embedded structures. So things that consist of a constituent that contains a constituent of the same kind. For example, the largest of these Russian nesting dolls contains smaller dolls of the same kind. And these structures can be an important part of language. For example, you can take a sentence like the cat meowed and embed the dog chased into the center of the sentence. And that makes something like the cat the dog chased meowed. And theoretically, you can continue to do this forever. But even with two center embedded phrases, the sentence here begins to be hard to understand. And you can see that the sentence contains some important things here. So for one, it has long distance dependencies, such that it's the man that's referring to scolded, the dog to chased, and the cat to meow. And this is an example of a center embedded sentence, but you can also have tail embedded sentences as well. So I'm going to be focusing on these center embedded structures because they provide a really interesting test case for the combinatorial capacities of subjects. So recursion, center embedded structures, and hierarchical representations have all been implicated in the development of a number of cognitive abilities, including language, right? You can have these center embedded structures in language. You can also have them in arithmetic and in mathematics, right? So you can have these operations embedded within larger operations. And they're also found in music, right? So you can have musical phrases that are embedded in larger musical phrases. And the capacity to represent these type of center embedded sequences has been hypothesized to be uniquely human, or sometimes even the sole difference that separates human from non-human animals, right? Largely popularized by Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch. However, there's actually pretty little comparative empirical work that supports this claim. So the questions I'm going to ask here are, can monkeys learn a center embedded grammar in an artificial language task? And not only can they learn it, but can they generate novel center embedded sequences? And this is also going to help answer the question of whether the ability to represent these center embedded sequences comes about through language learning, as some have suggested. We're also going to investigate when this ability develops in children, right? So when do children have access to the ability to represent these center embedded structures? And importantly, we need a task that actually taps center embedded recursion, like in this example sentence here. So to do that, I use these bracket images, which each have an open bracket and then have a matched closed bracket. So here's the task we used. We trained subjects to touch these bracket images in a specific order on a touchscreen computer. So they saw a screen like this with the brackets randomly presented on their screen. For this example, you'd have to touch the open purple bracket, then touch the open orange bracket, and then close out the orange bracket before closing the purple bracket. And all of the images remain on the screen throughout the trial, and the subjects never see the order sort of listed like it is over here. After subjects learn by trial and error to touch them at 80% correct on the first training list, we give them a second training list. And this one's just like the first one, except it has some different brackets for positions 2 and 3 here. After subjects learn to correctly order both of these training lists, we then add a small percentage of these transfer trials here, right? So both sets of brackets in these transfer trials have only been presented in the center of the list during previous trials. For this transfer list, subjects receive positive feedback regardless of how they touch the images, right? So any order counts as correct. And although there's many possible orders that you could produce, there were only 3 types of responses that we saw more often than chance. The first were these center embedded responses, in which one of the sets of brackets is embedded inside the other set of brackets. We also saw these cross brackets, these crossed orders where the 2 open ones are touched first, and then we have a mismatch in which one comes in the 3rd and 4th position, right? So A2 here is sort of matched with B1 instead of B2. We also saw some of these tail embedded responses, or responses that are basically a pair and then another pair. And we chose the structure of this transfer list to rule out some alternative strategies. For example, if subjects are just using the transitional probabilities, so sort of what items come next to each other often in the training, then subjects should produce lots of these tail embedded sequences, right? Because this preserves both the orange items that were next to each other and the pink items that were next to each other. If instead subjects are using something like an associative ordinal strategy, or just knowing that the open brackets come first and the closed brackets come later, then we should see lots of crossing errors. And we should actually see an equal mix of these center embedded structures and the crossing errors, because both of these have the open brackets first and then the closed brackets second. So we should see sort of 50-50 mix if subjects are just using an associative ordinal strategy that says these come earlier than these in the learned list. So we tested this task in monkeys, 3- and 4-year-old children, Chimani adults who have little to no experience with these mathematical brackets, as well as US adults. So here's a video of a monkey doing this task. So the first 2 trials are training trials. And then you're going to see one of the transfer trials that's occasionally mixed in. Okay, so you can see that there the monkey happened to do the right thing, but let's take a closer look at our results to see what we actually get here. So here are the results for the transfer trials, right? These are just the trials that the monkeys and the humans get positive reinforcement regardless of their response. So on the y-axis, we're going to show the proportion of trials. And then in green, we have the number of center embedded responses. In red, we have the number of cross responses. And in blue, we have the tail embedded responses. So you can see that all the human groups were really good at this task, right? They had significantly more center embedded responses than cross responses. So even the very young children seem to transfer the center embedded structure to a novel list and then be able to produce new exemplars of these center embedded orders. However, when we look at the monkeys, they were equally likely to use a center embedded and a crossed order, right? And this suggests that they might be using something like an associative ordinal strategy, or knowing that the open brackets generally come earlier than the closed brackets, and just relying on that sort of half of the correct answer. So center embedding wasn't the first strategy used by the monkeys, but we wanted to test whether they can learn to use this type of center embedded strategy. So to do this, we gave monkeys additional exposure to more center embedded lists, right? So the same monkeys were trained on 2 additional training lists. And then after that, we began to mix in a small number of transfer trials, just like we did before, right? So again, these were the inner items from these last 2 training lists. So what we found on this second attempt here was that with just a small amount of additional exposure, the monkeys began using a center-embedded strategy for this transfer list, right? So there were significantly more center-embedded responses than cross responses. You can also see a large number of these tail-embedded responses, which is a logical strategy, but just not the one that we're testing for here. So when we break down performance based on subject, you can see that these tail-embedded responses are coming from one specific animal who just happened to use a different strategy to complete this task. However, these other two animals both have significantly more center-embedded responses than cross responses, and actually are well within the range of US children, right? So this is comparing them to US children who didn't see as many training lists, who just saw the two training lists, and so this was their first attempt. And as a follow-up, we also tested monkeys' ability to generalize these structures to novel bracket images, right? So ones that they hadn't seen before in any training. And we found qualitatively similar results, right? So we found that the monkeys were using more center-embedded responses than cross responses or these tail responses. So far, I've shown that humans spontaneously use an abstract center-embedded embedding rule to solve the novel transfer trials. This was regardless of cultural experience, right? So both Chimane adults and US adults had similar results. And by the age of 3.5 years old, children spontaneously used a center-embedded recursive strategy. I've also showed that the capacity itself is not unique to humans, as some have suggested, right? So with some additional exposure, monkeys can learn to use the center-embedded strategy and then generalize this to novel stimuli. However, we found a difference between the humans and the monkeys in that only humans had a propensity to immediately extract the recursive structure from really very, very little data. So the next part of this talk, I want to talk through how adults and children might be representing these center-embedded recursive sequences. Right, so one possibility is that these sequences aren't really represented as true recursive sequences or ones that extend to any list that would be longer than 4 items, right? For example, these sequences could be represented as a 4-item algebraic sequence, something like A1, A2, B2, B1, right? So that's specific to those items and can't sort of generalize out any more than just sort of swapping in different A's and different B's. But if subjects have that type of representation, it would predict that these subjects won't be able to generalize these structures to longer lists, right? Because that A1, A2, B2, B1 doesn't extend like an AN, BN grammar. The next possibility that I'm going to talk through is a push-down stack. And this is a first in, last out type of memory structure. And this is what is often assumed in the literature for how participants might represent these type of sequences. And this is often how a computer program would sort of generate these sequences. But there's not much empirical support that the human mind actually implements push-down stacks. And the last potential that I'm going to talk through is a queue or a first in, first out type of memory structure, right? So this is sort of the first thing you hear is represented sort of in the first position, and then things are stored behind it. And then when you need to access it, you start from the beginning of that list, right? So it's sort of like representing a forwards list where you can start from the beginning. So I'm going to start by walking through a push-down stack. So here's a little example of how a push-down stack might work here. So if your goal is to represent this center-embedded string, and you have a stack, what you would do is you would first sort of touch the A item and then store it or push it. Then you would go to A2, store it, push it, and then A3. And then to produce this sort of second half of the list here, what you would have to do is actually just pop this item and then match the A3 to the B3. And then once that's removed, right, once that's been popped, then A2 is accessible, and then you can just pop that off. And then you're down to A1, and you can just pop that off and match, right? So this is pretty easy for a stack to be able to produce, right? Stacks are sort of meant for these types of representations. However, this type of data structure would have a much more difficult time producing forwards repeats or these cross-serial structures, where the form is something like A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3, right? So in order to produce the correct order, you would first have to store each of the A items just like before, right? The first half of the sequence is the same. But when it comes to produce the second half of the sequence in this cross-serial order, the only item that you have access to is actually A3. But it's not A3 that needs to be matched first. So what you would need to do is actually pop A3 off and end up storing it in a new stack. So you would need some sort of a pre-processing step to rearrange the stack that you have. And then after this pre-processing, then you could go through the same order, right? Because then A1's on top, you could pop it off and sort of step through like you did before. So what a push-down stack model predicts is that these center-embedded structures should be easier than cross-serial structures to represent. But a push-down stack isn't the only way of representing these sequences. Another potential memory structure that could be used is a queue or a first-in, first-out memory structure. So let me start by walking you through how this might work with a cross-serial grammar. So queues work in the opposite direction as a stack, right? So for the first three items, you store them in a list that can only be accessed from the beginning of that list, right? Then for the second half of the list, what you have to do to produce the cross-serial sequence is actually match the A's to the corresponding B's in the second half of the list, right? So this should be relatively easy for a queue to represent a cross-serial string because A1 is accessible, and then all you have to do is make one step to A2 and then match that to B2, and then the same thing with the third, right? So this cross-serial structure should be pretty easy if you're representing this in something like Q. For center-embedded sequences, you'd have to store the A items in the same way, right? Again, because the A's, there's no difference between these two strings. But when you get to this fourth item here, where you start is A1, but what you're looking to match is the third sort of indexed item. So what you'd have to do is actually walk through this. You'd have to step through your queue and go A1, A2, A3, okay, and then pull that and match that with the B. And then for the second item, you'd have to do the same thing. You'd have to step through a little bit less to get to the item you need to match. And then for the third one, again, you'd have to sort of only step to the beginning one. So this one should be faster than the others. So generally what we might see if a queue is being implemented is that center-embedded structures might be harder because you have to iteratively step through a queue in order to get the right sequencing. So here's the actual task we used. This was pre-registered on OSF. We trained subjects who were 3 to 6-year-old children and adults to touch these images in a specific order on the touch screen. The underlying structure of the order was either a center-embedded structure, such as moon, crown, crown, moon, or a cross-serial structure, such as moon, crown, crown. And subjects were trained on 2 of these center-embedded or cross-serial sequences, depending on the condition, before moving on to testing. Okay, we then gave subjects completely novel images to see how they would order them, right? So we gave subjects positive feedback on these new trials, regardless of their response. Then after 10 of these non-reinforced trials, then we started reinforcing them again to make sure that we're reinforcing which condition they are and that they sort of should be representing them in a specific way. But then after they're retrained on these 4 items, then we move them onto these 6 items, right? So here we're testing whether the 4 item sequences and structures that were learned can be extended to novel levels of embedding. We then did the same thing with 8 items. So here are the results, right? So adults in the center embedded condition had more errors than adults in the cross-serial condition for the novel 4-item lists. And that's the same thing with the 6-item, right? Where we actually see a large decrease here between the 4 and the 6 items. And then again, the cross-serial is sort of easier throughout this, right? So adults are much more accurate at generating these cross-serial orders. A stack-like procedure would actually predict the opposite. A Q model also makes specific predictions for response times for different points within a center embedded and a cross-serial sequence, right? So for the second half of these lists, a cross-serial sequence should be relatively easy and relatively fast if you're using a queue. In contrast, to produce a center embedded string, actually for this B3 item, what you'd have to do is step through multiple things, which would take some time. And then for B2, you'd have to make less steps, which would be a little quicker. So we should see a decreasing response time for the second half of these center embedded strings if subjects are using a queue to represent these structures. And that's exactly what we find, right? So in the center embedded condition, we find decreasing response times at it, just as a queue-like memory structure would predict. We also find similar results in children, right? So children produce more correct cross responses in a cross-serial condition than center embedded responses in the center embedded condition. So to further test that, what type of memory structure is used, we're trying to extend this in children to look for the same types of responses, sort of response time responses. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip a couple things and walk through some conclusions here, right? So monkeys, 3-year-old children and adults can represent center embedded structures, although monkeys need some additional exposure, right? This suggests that maybe language isn't needed to learn to represent these types of structures. Adults and children seem to be using a queue-like memory structure to represent and produce these center embedded structures. So we don't find any evidence of a push-down stack like is often assumed to be underlying these type of representations. And there are many differences between the sequence I've tested here and the sequences found in natural language. But there are also some commonalities, right? So in natural language, cross-serial phrases have been shown to be easier to represent than center embedded phrases in language as well. And with that, I'd like to thank the lab and everyone in the lab, as well as my mentors and the previous labs that I've been in that have supported this work.